Ah, here we go. Here.
Street in Cuba. This is just... Okay, I'm going to Google Street View in Zanzibar, right here. But I'm gonna try to convince you that the most interesting direction to look is not to the left or to the right, but down. Why does the revolutionary government of Zanzibar have a logo right here on this truck, which doesn't look like a normal Google Street View car? That's
Weird.
because this is the world of unofficial Google Street View. All these
Really?
lines are street views that Google
Nice.
doesn't make, but that still show up on Google Maps. This is the visualization of a secret
I didn't finish it.
economy that you can only see
Only 5 minutes
when you
in.
look down. It shows up everywhere, from
Okay.
hustling realtors
Master switch.
to explorers in the Australian bush. Wow.
Avionics.
I talked to him. To off-roaders across the world in Utah. Just look at this terrain. And look who's driving it. All the way to government corporate partnerships that have carved out a unique spot in the Google Street View world. Right there. I went through hundreds of Street View images, I talked to a ton of people, and I came up with 5 categories for the secret economics of Google Street View. It is surprising, it is secretive, and it says something about the economy of...
Oh. Have I seen this one? I think I have.
Hello everyone. Today I'd like to talk about the ongoing
Oh.
events in Palestine. Now, talking about an ongoing event isn't all that usual for me on this channel, but honestly I've found it hard to focus on anything else recently, which I'm sure a lot of you will understand.
I was at the
Worshippers
part.
inside
Oh,
with an assault
Baruch.
rifle, killing 29 people, including children. as
Baruch
young as
Goldstein.
12. He was then beaten to death, which is the only good thing that happened there that day. I mentioned
The gross thing about this motherfucker is that, see, oh, I'm already worked up. Politicians now have fucking his picture, like, at their offices because they consider Baruch Goldstein a fucking hero.
the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre now because Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's current Minister of National Security, used to keep a portrait of Goldstein, the perpetrator of the massacre, in his living room. He removed it when he entered politics, which was only 4 years ago. I'm not going to list off the countless other massacres, assassinations, invasions, displacements, and so on that Israel has carried out in order to defend its colonial project. We really would be here all day if I did that. And the Zionist response to every one of those crimes would be to say, well, we only did that because the Palestinians did this to us. To which the Palestinians could say, well, we only did that because you did this to us, and so on and so forth. This is the loop of violence and counter-violence that certain people would like to pretend is the whole history. But no, the violence and counter-violence have a source, which is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. That ethnic cleansing is rooted in an ideology of inequality, the ideology behind Zionism and colonialism, the idea that different groups of people should be subject to different rights, and should be treated
rights every time I learn a new tidbit.
different. When trying to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, far too much focus is put on what the Palestinians would have to accept, whereas it's often taken for granted that Israel will continue to be run by colonial Zionist supremacists, and no peaceful solution is ever going to work if that's the case. Colonial Zionists aren't going to accept half of the land they want to colonize being given to the Palestinians as some sort of two-state solution.
They're not.
They don't want the Palestinians to have official statehood,
They want
full membership
them to have
in the UN,
anything.
like that, because it would make them much harder to ethnically cleanse, which is the goal. Nor are they going to accept a single-state solution, a secular Israel with equal rights for all, perhaps the
Fuck
right
no,
to
it's the promised land. What are you talking about?
reparations paid and all
Hey,
that.
no worries.
Because if millions
Tell,
of Palestinians
your girlfriend I said
get
hello.
rights and can vote, that's the end of Zionism, right?
Yeah.
The Zionists
Tell her I
who
said
maintain
hello.
control of Israel do not want either of these solutions. What we have right now is a single state, an apartheid state. Israel functionally controls the whole territory. The Palestinians have very limited official power. Israel has them blockaded in Gaza. They can't move freely. They don't control their own trade or borders or airspace. If they march peacefully for their rights, as they did weekly in 2018 to 19, the IDF shoots them in the thousands. There's a point to be made about the inevitability of violent resistance in these sorts of situations. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable, so said JFK. If you deny a people their rights and you strike down all non-violent methods for them to attain those rights, what is left are the violent methods. Now, statements about the inevitability of the violence that arises in these situations are often misconstrued as support for the violence itself, but that couldn't be further from the truth. If someone douses themselves in gasoline and then strikes a match, I can tell you what's going to happen, but that doesn't mean I think it's good. I think it's a tragedy, actually. But pointing out that you go on fire if you take those actions is not a celebration of you going on fire. It's a warning against taking those actions. Enforcing an apartheid state takes violence, necessarily, and so invites violent reaction, necessarily. Of course, Zionists would say that attacks like those perpetrated by Hamas on October 7th of last year necessarily invite violent reaction themselves, but this is the old pretending history is just a cycle of violence and counter-violence dodge again. It is not. The violence has a root, and it's the violence Israel is using to enforce an apartheid state. Imagine Bill punches Tom because Tom punched Bill because Bill punched Tom, and so on and so forth. A cycle of violence. If you weren't around to see the start of this chain of violence, it's impossible to decipher who's the instigator and so who is at fault. This is what some people would like you to think the Israel-Palestine conflict is. But now imagine that same cycle of violence, only Tom broke into Bill's house and chained him to a radiator first. And then Bill hits Tom, who hits Bill, who hits Tom, and so on. And the situation is different now, because even though it's the same cycle of violence, only one party has the power to end it non-violently. And Israel holds that power with regards to the situation in Gaza. Also, the United States, as Israel's principal backer, has power with regards to that situation, via the enormous leverage it holds over Israel, or could hold over Israel
But it doesn't.
It chose to. The Palestinians in Gaza could not, tomorrow, decide to peacefully bring an end to the apartheid state they live in, but the Zionists in Israel could, and that's the difference. It's not very likely, but they could. They have the majority of the power, and so they bear a majority of the responsibility. Hamas's attack on October 7th was in its scale and deadliness an enormous embarrassment for Israel's government and military. It made the IDF look utterly incompetent and exposed Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, as a reckless, arrogant fraud, as if that needed any more doing. Netanyahu's strategy was, as he himself has said, to bolster Hamas to keep the Palestinians in Gaza divided from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, with Hamas's militarism and frequent rocket attacks fired at Israel used as a pretext for avoiding peace talks. Netanyahu claimed an ability to control the height of the flames in Gaza, casting himself as a master manipulator who could manage Hamas and prevent them from doing any real damage. And then, of course, on October 7th, his ability to control the situation was exposed as an illusion. The enormous destruction in Gaza we've seen in the last few months is in part a desperate attempt to re-establish legitimacy and project an appearance of strength. It has nothing really to do with stopping Hamas or rescuing hostages. The safest thing for the hostages would obviously be to negotiate a ceasefire, and the widespread bombing and collective punishment of Palestinian civilians is not doing anything at all to make those civilians want to side with Israel over Hamas. The IDF's strategy of indiscriminate bombing and the effects they profess to believe the bombing campaign will have, like claiming it will ramp up civilian pressure on Hamas, are another element of this situation which seems out of the history books, from a time before we all learned that that doesn't work. My country has a proud national belief in how British civilians reacted during the Blitz, the German bombing campaign against the UK in the Second World War.
Keep going.
In that campaign, tens of thousands of civilians were killed in bombing raids which came daily. Millions of houses were damaged or destroyed. Some images of London from the time look like Gaza today, but the morale of the British civilians did not break. They did not turn on their government or demand a surrender. And many other countries have similar beliefs about the resilience of their own civilians when their country is under attack. And that we expect the Palestinians to act differently is a manifestation of the dehumanizing way in which Palestinians are often considered. They're not expected to act the same way we do, as if when they're bombed they'll just panic and scatter like animals who heard a loud noise. And this dehumanizing attitude manifests in another way. First, even if we imagine the colonial Zionist plan to annex all current Palestinian-held territory somehow succeeded, countries bordering Israel will then be filled with millions more displaced Palestinian refugees, who would be rightfully and justifiably pissed off about being kicked out of their homes, and the fighting will continue. A Palestinian diaspora will not dissipate any more than a Jewish one would. This is one of the fundamental contradictions of Zionism. That Zionists hold some historic or religious right to the land based on who was there thousands of years ago, but the Palestinian population we kick out today will just go and become Lebanese or Egyptian or whatever and completely forget their heritage. This only makes sense if you believe the Palestinians
Balboa, Balboa, 6-9 Mike Oscar, rodando pista 3-6. Balboa, Balboa, 6-9 Mike Oscar, taxiing runway
so long as
3-6, yeah, platform, taxi, Alpha,
the fate
6-9
of
Mike
Israel
Oscar.
will be eternal conflict with its neighbors, which some extremist Zionists would be quite happy about, it should be pointed out. There is a movement within Zionism that argues Israel needs to expand its borders. Early last year, Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich gave a speech behind a podium featuring a map of a Greater Israel, which included not just the current Palestinian territories, but also parts of Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Reading about the history of Zionism, there's a sense that it simply arrived too late, that it missed the historical window for what it's trying to do. There's a good quote from the 100 Years' War on Palestine, where Khalidi says Zionists have been trying to do the impossible, to impose a colonial reality on Palestine in a post-colonial age. In the decades after Israel was founded in 1948, many other colonial projects folded up. Israel was closely allied militarily and economically with apartheid South Africa, an obvious ideological sibling of colonial Zionism, being a socially stratified settler state. But that system came to an official end in the 90s, after international pressure was applied for reasons that could apply equally to Israel today. I want to go on a tangent now and talk for a while about one of the reasons that this colonial reality is harder to implement today than the 1800s say, and it has to do with the popular perception of war and violence. So if you wanted to find out the truth of what was happening on the ground in any given conflict, written and oral accounts were all you had to go on, for a very long time. For an example here, I remember, as I'm sure a lot of people in the UK will, being taught Wilfred Owen's poetry at school. Wilfred Owen was a poet and soldier who fought for the British in the First World War, and I remember particularly a poem of his titled Dulce et Decorum Est. This poem was written as a response to propagandistic pro-war poetry, particularly the works of Jesse Pope, a writer whose poems were published in the Daily Mail to encourage enlistment in the armed forces. Pope's poems portray war as just a big fun game, an opportunity to win personal and national glory, a way to show your manly grit, earn the empire's thanks and all that. It was jingoistic rubbish, basically. Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est paints a scene in which a group of exhausted soldiers are attacked with chlorine gas artillery shells. One soldier cannot put on his gas mask in time and dies horrifically, guttering, choking, drowning. Images of the dying man haunt the writer's dreams. We see his body flung on the back of a wagon, his hanging face vomiting blood at every jolt. The imagery is terrifying and disgusting, and the poem ends by chiding those who encourage the youth to rush off to war to earn glory for themselves. Death in war is not sweet or glorious, the poem says. It's violent and disturbing and horrible, and certainly nothing to celebrate. Today, of course, hardly anyone cares about the jingoistic pro-war poetry, whereas the experiences of anti-war poets are taught in schools and have come to define the popular perception of what the war was like for those actually experiencing it. As for why that is, I'd say a large part of it is that the accounts from sources actually involved in the conflict were more truthful. Now, something happened in the 1960s which made the imagery of war even more accessible to the average person: the proliferation of television. More and more American households, for instance, came to own a television set, and consequently the Vietnam War, which the US was involved in at the time, became the first televised war. Now, one result of this is that a media that had previously relied on government press releases and reports could now bypass official channels and just show people footage of what was actually happening. Citizens could now, from inside their own homes, see images and videos that demonstrated the brutality of war, bombings, executions, atrocities, and so on. This access to the imagery of the horror and violence of war, along with what was often a large disparity between what they were seeing and what their government officials were telling them was going on, correlates with a strong shift in public opinion away from support for the war. It is harder to drum up support for
Fuck, the wind's just
see the
shifted.
violent
God damn it.
results of that war. And we're seeing something similar happening today. Just as official government sources were undercut by the more immediate and truthful news media, today the government and news media are being undercut by something even more immediate and truthful: the people themselves. Over time, more of the world has access to the internet and social media, and more of the world's population have access to smartphones with cameras that can record and upload footage from anywhere. And this is how a lot of people, particularly young people, are finding out about what's going on in the world. The older media structures are still around, of course, but there's very much a generational divide in where people are getting their news from. A young person is increasingly more likely to be informed about something going on in the world by posts on social media sites than by reading a newspaper or watching TV news. There are Palestinians who run social media accounts with hundreds of thousands to millions of followers. Here's a Palestinian filmmaker with 4 million Instagram followers who posts updates from within Gaza, for instance. I spent a lot of time thinking about this one post from the account of an artist on Twitter, which they posted after being injured in an Israeli attack and losing an eye and the use of their hand. Being able to hear the voices of those hurt by the violence in such an immediate way is a new thing. Also, there's a, I want to say, social element to the way that information is being shared and received online that I think is worth considering. People typically aren't scrolling completely random social media feeds, are they? They're following people who they like and want to hear from. It's not just that they're getting news from that place, they're getting news from the people they like and trust at that place. Because of the internet, people increasingly have a connection to places and peoples they otherwise wouldn't. I follow people on Twitter, for instance, who have been killed in this current
Oh, the
conflict.
people on
They aren't just
Twitter.
another number counted among the dead to me. They're someone whose words I've read and voices I've heard. They are someone to me. There's more of a personal connection than if you just heard
True.
about a random death on the news. One of the people I follow is Rafat Al-Ariya, a Palestinian professor.
Rest in peace, Rafat.
His final poem, If I Must Die, calls on the reader to use his death to bring hope to the children of Gaza, and is especially moving in light of the fact that he was indeed murdered shortly after posting it. The widespread sharing and translating of If I Must Die has been very touching to see. In relation to this, I have to mention an article in Tablet magazine written by a chap called Maxim D. Schreier, which discusses Al-Ariya and his poetry. This article is a hastily put together and poorly constructed hack job, rushed out after Al-Ariya's murder in a sad attempt to push back against the surge of interest in his writing brought about by said murder. Al-Ariya's work, tenderly keening at its best and banal and formulaic at its average, relies on strained cultural and historical transpositions, says Schreier. Schreier also complains that Al-Ariya portrays Israel as a new Nazi state and Gazans as that state's victims, which I'm not really sure we can criticize him for, given that Israel assassinated him. But anyway, this Maxim D. Schreier certainly seems to know a lot about poetry. So how about we read some of Schreier's poetry? Surely it's not going to be banal and formulaic. Jewish detractors of Israel. Israel's Jewish detractors, do you experience remorse? How does it feel to be traitors? Lo's the price of your voice. Jewish self-hatred runs rampant. When Israel's under attack, Israel emerges triumphant, breaking her enemies back. Singular. Jewish detractors, can Israel manage without your brain cells? Yes, undeniably, easily. You, who so openly, eagerly side with the enemies of Israel, how can you live with yourselves?
Ugh.
Well, presumably pretty easily, given that the poem seems to think their betrayal is functionally meaningless, since Israel will apparently succeed regardless of what they do, which gives rise to the question, what is the poet complaining about exactly? This poem is poorly written, jingoistic shite, comparable to the sorts of poetry Wilfred Owen was writing in response to, and in the future, when school children learn about what happened in Gaza, they will be reading Palestinian poetry, and the fate of this poem will be for it to be a joke, in this video. Also, if you ever feel like you have imposter syndrome, Maxim D. Schreier has a Guggenheim Fellowship, so enjoy knowing that. Anyway, back to social media. So, just as the victims of the
Guggenheim
oppression have social
Fellowship.
media accounts they can post to, the perpetrators of the oppression have social media accounts they can post to. I have seen in the past few months videos shot by IDF soldiers themselves of them destroying humanitarian aid, stealing from Palestinian homes, needlessly destroying the interior of Palestinian businesses, singing genocidal songs about how there are no uninvolved civilians in Gaza, and so on. There's a very jarring effect that happens when the older propaganda structures try to process all of this immediately available information, and I can summarize it here by showing you one Twitter interaction. So, in response to a tweet saying, "Breaking, United States says there is no sign of any deliberate Israeli war crimes in Gaza conflict," Twitter user Rob Rousseau replied, "We've all been watching a non-stop stream of deliberate Israeli war crimes on our phones for months now." So I'll speak to the younger people in the audience here. Things were different back in the olden days before the internet and smartphone cameras.
Back in my
First,
day.
we would hear the lie. that hospital we attacked is actually a secret terrorist bunker, or whatever. And then later, you would find out the truth, that it was just a hospital after all. Or you wouldn't find out the truth, and you'd just go on believing the lie. Now, this order of things made sense, like temporal sense. It could be outrageous and infuriating if you later discovered that your government or media or military had been lying to you, but there was less of a sense of personal culpability in the matter, because after all, you're just some civilian. How are you supposed to personally verify what you're being told is happening in some war across the globe? But now, things are different. Now the hospital has a Twitter page, the doctors are giving live streaming interviews among the bodies, the staff are filming themselves being shot at, you can see the terrified patients without medical supplies in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. All the violence and terror of it is streaming out live as it happens. On social media, you'll see Israel supporting Western politicians saying they have seen no evidence of Israeli war crimes, right next to videos of Israeli soldiers using Palestinian civilians as human shields, which is a war crime. Because if the IDF decide to use a Palestinian civilian as a human shield, there's someone in a building nearby filming it with a smartphone now, because of course there is. The whole thing is just absurd and maddening. That human shield thing happened in the West Bank, by the way. Let me just run through why that's important very quickly. The current Palestinian territories are the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Now, Hamas does not control the West Bank. Israel's excuse for its war crimes and excessive violence in Gaza, that it is trying to stop Hamas, does not apply in the West Bank. But Israel still commits war crimes there. Last year, even before Hamas's attack in October, Israeli forces had killed more than 200 Palestinians in the West Bank alone. In June, the IDF were carrying out airstrikes against a refugee camp in the West Bank. This is just the daily reality for Palestinians. Anyway, one other thing we have now that we never used to have is automatic translation software integrated into social media. Now you can click Translate Post and see Israeli politicians saying, to a domestic audience, that they support ethnic cleansing and the likes. What would previously have been hidden or downplayed or excused or softened in translation for an international audience is just out there for all to see. There's no comforting, plausible
never hit
because we know what's going on.
never hit
We
translate on a
often know the news
fucking
hitting the mainstream media.
Hebrew
We often know
post.
before the politicians have even had a chance to
Hi,
lie to us
midnight.
about it. We know before the dust settles and investigations into war crimes start, or don't, and we still have to watch it all slowly play out the same as if we didn't know. It used to be said that a lie can get around the world before the truth can get its boots on, but today we're often seeing the opposite happen. The truth is arriving before the...
I was planning for runway 16, and then the wind fucking changed, and now I have to go all the way back.
lies. If you look at the coverage and international reaction to the horrors unfolding in Gaza and feel like you're living in some sort of bizarro world, I think this is a big part of why. The older power structures just can't keep up with the internet. Now, you might be tempted to fall into despair with how little that seems to matter. You know, even if you do know
But this
the
is true,
system
yeah.
seemingly just keeps on as it was, even if it has to deny reality. The United States wants a power base in the Middle East, a belligerent state it can sell arms to project power from, and so on, and it wants that more than it cares about the lives of Palestinian people. So Israel gets all the arms and diplomatic cover it wants. It's incredibly depressing. But one important thing to point out here is that the United States is willing to tell Israel to get lost, and do things that Israel does not want the United States to do. Israel does not like it when the United States deals favorably with or sells arms to their regional enemies, for instance. One reason it's important to point this out is that there's a bigoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that the United States backs Israel only because of some nefarious Jewish plot to infiltrate and control the government. But that just isn't borne out in reality. There are plenty of times the United States has, when they've come into conflict, ranked its own interests above Israel's. There have been times in the past when Israeli aggression towards the Palestinians or its neighbors has been halted by an order from the US president, using all that leverage they have. This could be for a few reasons. The conscience of the president, or more likely either domestic political concerns or a more far-sighted view of foreign policy than the politicians running Israel have. The US is typically happy to support Israel in its ethnic cleansing campaign, they just prefer it happen quietly and less embarrassingly. Maybe they also realize that without someone to step in and tell them no every now and then, Israel will self-destruct.
And I am watching it on a higher speed.
Unfortunately, Joe Biden is
1.5?
one of the worst people on the planet to be the American president right at this moment, with his seemingly infinite patience for spirals of genocidal hatred and his inability to remember things. Back in the 80s, when even Republican President Ronald Reagan ordered Israel to stop bombing Lebanon, a younger Joe Biden reportedly said he would go even further than Israel, even to the point of stating he supported killing women and children. Biden's position was so extreme that even the then Israeli Prime Minister distanced himself from Biden's comments. So, okay, the situation is bleak and depressing, the death toll is climbing, social media feeds and news media are filled with images of war crimes and murders and atrocities, and the person most able to leverage an immediate end to all of this is not doing so. So, what comes next? Well, I honestly don't know. I can't see the future. So I'm going to go on a tangent here and tell you about a feeling that I have. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is a 1973 short work of philosophical
Molest.
fiction by American writer Ursula K. Le Guin. The story paints a scene for the reader. It's a splendid summer festival taking place in Omelas, a utopian city bright towered by the sea. Omelas is presented as a place of incredible happiness and celebration. The people are joyous and content. There is no war or crime or poverty or inequality. It is as perfect a society as you can imagine, and the reader is urged by the narrator of the work to make edits to their own imaginary Omelas if they feel it warrants it. If the citizens of Omelas seem too prim and proper for your tastes, you're encouraged to imagine some sex and drugs in there if that's what you want. If you want them to have modern or even future technology, you're free to imagine that. The narrator offers their opinions on what they think Omelas is like, but it is only an opinion. For the piece to work to its intended effect, the reader needs to believe that Omelas is a utopia, whatever that means for them. The Omelas you end up imagining is thus a collaborative effort on behalf of the writer and the reader. After introducing Omelas and its people in all their splendor and happiness, the narrator goes on to describe one more thing about the city, its singular sin. By some magical contract or other, the abundance and beauty and joy of Omelas requires that one child of the city be kept in a state of miserable isolation and poverty. In a cellar under one of the buildings of the city, a single child is kept alone, filthy, starving, and ignored. And the terms of whatever contract brought this about are so strict that even a single word or act of kindness towards the child would break the utopian spell on the city. This fact about their society, we are told, is explained to the children of Omelas when they seem capable of understanding. They are taken to see the child and are invariably shocked and sickened at the sight. And I quote, "They feel anger, outrage, impotence despite all the explanations. They would like to do something for the child, but there is nothing they can do. If the child were brought up into the sunlight out of that vile place, if it were cleaned and fed and comforted, that would be a good thing indeed. But if it were done in that day and hour, all the prosperity and beauty and delight of Omelas would wither and be destroyed. Those are the terms." The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas is more of a philosophical exercise than a traditional story. What if all the suffering and inequality of a society was borne by a single individual? What if a society's underclass was reduced to just one person? Could you still live there, happily, knowing that your happiness comes at the expense of another who is suffering? Could you accept those terms? After we're told about the young people of Omelas feeling great anger and sadness upon finding out about the child, we're told how they rationalize it. And to quote again, "But as time goes on, they begin to realize that even if the child could be released, it would not get much good of its freedom. A little vague pleasure of warmth and food, no real doubt, but little more. It's too degraded and imbecile to know any real joy. It's been afraid too long to ever be free of fear. Its habits are too uncouth for it to respond to humane treatment. Indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about it to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement to sit in. Their tears at the bitter injustice dry when they begin to perceive the terrible justice of reality, and to accept it. This is obviously similar to how a lot of people rationalize the poverty and suffering of the real world. There is suffering, but there's nothing we can really do about it. That's just how the world is. We might not like it, but what can we do? They probably wouldn't be able to appreciate living better anyway. Poverty is what they know. All that rubbish. But we're told one last thing about Omelas, and it's that sometimes individual citizens of Omelas do not accept it, they cannot rationalize it, and they leave. These are the titular Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Sometimes a citizen of Omelas, after seeing the child, will fall silent and leave home. To quote the conclusion of the story, "Each alone, they go west or north towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas, they walk ahead into the darkness, and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the City of Happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It's possible that it does not exist, but they seem to know where they're going, the ones who walk away from Omelas." I think about this piece of writing lately for a few reasons. The first is the obvious parallel between the citizens in the story knowing the child is there suffering, and me and other citizens of Israel supporting Western nations going about our lives knowing that our governments are supporting a genocide, one that is killing many children particularly. It makes me imagine an Omelas with our modern internet, with pictures and videos of the suffering child on your television and your phone filling your social media feeds. What if the suffering of the child was not just
sucked into the video?
You could rationalize away.
I get
What if
you.
instead
Yeah,
of
same.
being around, it was inescapable? How many more people would feel they had to walk away? Or, on the other hand, what would the people who decide to stay in Omelas have to tell themselves in order to justify it? I've seen a persistent narrative in response to videos of injured or murdered children on social media, where a supporter of Israel's actions will declare the thing in the video to not be a person at all, but a doll. All images of dead Palestinian children to these people have to be fakes, terrorist propaganda that can be dismissed out of hand. This isn't true, and it's not rationally believable.
Why is it not adding it?
It's comforting if you can con yourself into believing it. So I suppose any Omelas with an internet would also have a lively conspiracy theory about how the child isn't actually real, so they have nothing to feel guilty about. The other reason I've been thinking about this story lately is the open and ambiguous.
Oh, thank you for banning that person,
Midnight.
Midnight.
Ones who walk away from Omelas are going, or what they're going to do when they get there. They leave, we can suppose, because they cannot accept the inequality of the society in which they live. Living in Omelas, considering themselves to be Omelonian or whatever, means accepting the inequality of that society. When someone decides they cannot accept it, they cease to be of that place. Now obviously, people who live in our societies are not literally walking away to live in the mountains or something, but there still is that disconnection, the feeling you've been cut off in some way by how you cannot accept what is going on. There's a friction between seeing the leaders of your nation act in narrow, selfish, short-sighted, cruel ways, and a growing sense of global empathy,
Okay.
I suppose, which
We'll
is
just
mediated
monitor
by
this.
technology.
That's
When I see
fine.
the leaders of the political parties in my country falling over themselves to excuse and aid genocide, I feel disgusted.
Balboa, Balboa,
I feel no
6-9
allegiance
Mike
to
Oscar,
any society
despegando
like that, and
pista,
I'd trade the whole lot of them for the life of one.
despegando pista 0, próximo 18, Balboa, Balboa, 6-9 Mike Oscar, taking off runway 18, departing to the west, Balboa, Balboa. Okay, RPMs.
Palestinian child. I wonder to what degree national cohesion relies on an assumption that the citizens of one nation will side with that nation over others when they come into conflict, and how much of that was assured only because the other people were far away and their suffering could not be witnessed easily. An in-group out-group bias is harder to utilize if people can see the out-group suffering and start sympathizing with them. Where I have felt sympathy here is for the victims of colonial Zionism, the people hurt by the violence it requires to maintain, of course, but also the people hurt by the inevitable reactions to that violence. Where I felt a sense of connection or identity, it isn't national, racial, or religious. It's moral, I suppose. I feel a shared sense of connection with everyone else who is outraged by the horrific violence being carried out in Gaza. Those are my people, regardless of where they are, or what they look like, or what language they're speaking. The case made by the oppressors in these specific
Crew
contexts
final
we're talking about
check.
today is that Muslims or Arabs are all violent terrorists, a bloodthirsty mob of barbarians who will behead you or blow you up the first time you drop your guard. When I see an IDF graphic declaring X amount of, quote, terrorists killed, where they obviously arrived at that number by simply assuming everyone they killed was a terrorist, it makes me wonder how many times in history the size of an enemy military force was arrived at by simply counting the bodies afterwards, civilian or not. Going along with these sorts of narratives requires you to accept a racist othering of groups of people. There are inherent enemies, you have to believe, people who are born bad because of their race or religion or whatever, and so discriminating against them is not only right, it makes good sense. In relation to that, I want to start to close out today by thinking about a question I've seen asked and have been asked myself as well, and it's this. Jewish people have, many times in history, been subject to that sort of racist othering. They've been portrayed as inherently untrustworthy outsiders who subvert society to their own ends, blamed for a whole variety of societal ills which were not their fault, and been subject to the worst sorts of racial discrimination and oppression. So how is it that Israel, the self-proclaimed Jewish state, is now the one perpetrating many of those same crimes? How can they be forcing Palestinians off their lands and creating an international diaspora of refugees? How can they be carrying out against the Palestinians many of the same crimes that Nazi Germany carried out against Jewish people? And I have two answers for questions like this. And the first is quite simple. Zionism is not synonymous with Jewishness, and in fact there is a long history of Zionist anti-Semitism. Not all Jewish people are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. One of the most striking images I've seen from this recent conflict is a video of the Israeli police attacking ultra-Orthodox Jewish residents of Jerusalem. Many ultra-Orthodox Jews are anti-Zionist for various reasons. The police in this video were allegedly called in to take down Palestinian flags in the neighborhood. This is how the Zionist state treats Jewish people who step out of line. And stories like this have been all too common. An Israeli teacher was put into solitary confinement for criticizing the Israeli military on social media. The Israeli police cracked down hard on anti-war protests in Israel. The editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post writes articles about how anti-Zionist Jews are not representative of the Jewish community, and are only technically, but not really Jewish. We need to view them as lost to our people and treat them as such. Even protests organized by anti-war Jewish groups in other countries often get dismissed as anti-Semitic. Also, as an example of just how far Zionist anti-Semitic rhetoric can go, let me tell you about Itzik Zarka, an activist for Benjamin Netanyahu's political party, pictured here embracing Netanyahu. Last year, Zarka was caught on video shouting at protesters, quote, Ashkenazim, whores, may you burn in hell, referring to Jews of Eastern European origin. I am proud of the 6 million that were burned. I wish that another 6 million will be burned, Zarka said at the time, referencing the Holocaust. So yes, it really does go that far. There are two